They say that a family is built on a foundation of shared history, but no one ever tells you who is expected to carry the weight of that history and who is allowed to simply exist inside of it. You learn very quickly in a dynamic like mine that being extremely useful is the easiest way to remain completely invisible. My name is Jessica. I work in pediatric rehabilitation. I spend my days on the floor with children, helping them learn how to move again after accidents or illnesses have betrayed their small bodies. It is quiet work, and it requires endless patience, but it is deeply real to me. My family, however, prefers things that are loud and shiny and easily explained at a dinner party. I had driven 2 hours to get to my parents' house for our traditional Sunday dinner. The moment I walked through the front door, the house already felt heavy with preparation. My father did not ask how my drive was or how my week had been. He pointed toward this dining room, and he told me that David was bringing a new girl tonight and that I needed to make sure everything looked absolutely perfect. David is my older brother. In the solar system of our family, David is the sun, and the rest of us are just planets lucky enough to be caught in his warm orbit. He went to the right universities, and he got the right job in corporate finance, and he never once strayed from the clear path my father laid out for him. Because of that, my father looks at David like a mirror reflecting his own success back at him. I chose a completely different path. I do not think my father ever truly forgave me for not caring about corporate ladders or corner offices or things he could brag about to his friends. He never said it out loud, but he showed his disappointment by handing me the apron every single time I walked into his house. I took my coat off and I walked straight into the kitchen. I did not sit down. I have never sat down in that house before. A dinner is completely ready. I grabbed the familiar linen apron from the hook on the pantry door, and I tied it tight around my waist. The fabric was soft from years of washing, and it felt like a uniform I was never allowed to take off. I started pulling out the everyday plates, the blue stoneware ones we always use for family meals, but my father walked into the kitchen and stopped me. He stood with his arms crossed and he said, "We are using the good plates tonight, Jessica, the white ones with the gold trim." He said, "This new girl, Megan, is very important to your brother, and we need to make the right impression." I looked at the heavy blue plates in my hands. I had eaten off those plates for years. I had brought my own friends over, and we had eaten off those casual plates. But David was bringing someone new, and suddenly the entire table needed to be elevated. I swallowed the tight knot forming in my throat, and I quietly put the blue plates away. I reached up to the high cabinet, and I brought down the white and gold set. I carried them carefully to the dining room, and I started setting the long wooden table. I placed the silver forks, and I aligned the knives perfectly, and I folded the cloth napkins into neat, crisp squares. I counted the heavy wooden chairs. There was a handwritten place card at the head of the table for my father, and one for my mother, and one for David, and one beautifully written card that said Megan. I looked at the small space at the far end of the table near the swinging kitchen door. That was always my spot. There was no card there. There never was a card for me. I was the person who placed the cards, so I suppose they thought I did not need a piece of paper to know where I belonged. I stood there holding a crystal water glass, and I looked at that empty space where my name was not written. Something deep inside my chest felt incredibly heavy. It was not sharp anger, and it was not petty jealousy. It was a profound aching exhaustion, the kind that settles in your bones. I was so deeply tired of setting beautiful tables for people who did not even notice I was standing in the room. I placed the water glass down, and I smoothed out the white tablecloth, making sure the edges hung perfectly even. I could hear my father in the living room talking loudly on the phone about David and his new promotion. I was just the daughter in the kitchen making sure the gold rims on the plates caught the evening light. I took a deep breath and I prepared myself to disappear into the background. The front door opened and the house suddenly filled with loud voices. My mother came down the stairs, smoothing her dress, looking nervous. Extended family members started to arrive. My Aunt Susan walked in first. She kissed my cheek and she told me I looked tired. I smiled and I took her heavy winter coat. I hung it in the crowded closet and I hurried back to the quiet kitchen. I checked the roast in the oven. I pulled out the delicate crystal wine glasses. I carried a heavy tray of appetizers out to the brightly lit living room. People were gathering in small groups. They were laughing and they were catching up on the week. I moved between them, offering small plates filling empty glasses. I was the silent engine keeping the evening running smoothly. No one really looked at me. They looked past me or they looked at the food in my hands. I poured red wine for my uncle, and I brought my mother a glass of sparkling water. The doorbell rang again. My father rushed past me to open it. It was David. He walked in tall and incredibly confident. The energy in the room shifted immediately. Everyone turned toward him. He smiled and he hugged my father tightly. He looked around the room, taking in the warm applause of our family. My father put a heavy hand on David and his shoulder. He looked at the crowded room and he said, "The man of the hour has finally arrived." He spoke with so much pride it practically filled the air. I stood near the hallway holding an empty silver tray. I watched my father beam at his only son. David started telling a long story about a recent financial deal at his firm. The numbers were large and the stakes were very high. Everyone listened intently. I walked back into the kitchen and I started chopping vegetables for the dinner salad. The sound of their loud laughter drifted through the swinging kitchen door. I brought the large salad bowl out and I placed it carefully on the dining sideboard. My aunt turned to me. She asked, "How is your little job going, Jessica?" I stopped pouring the dressing. I looked at her and I prepared to answer. I wanted to tell her about the new physical therapy techniques we were using at the clinic. I wanted to tell her about the little boy who stood on his own for the very first time on Tuesday. But my father answered for me. He waved his hand dismissively and he said, "Oh, Jessica is still doing her little volunteer thing." He said it loudly so everyone could hear him over the music. He said she spends all day playing with sick kids on the floor. "It is very sweet," he added, "but I keep telling her she needs to think about a real career with a solid pension." I stood there completely frozen. I felt a hot flush creep up my neck. A real career. A volunteer thing. He had reduced my entire life, my entire passion to a simple hobby. I looked at David. He was nodding along with my father. He did not say a single word to defend me. He just took a sip of his expensive drink and he looked at the front door waiting for his new girlfriend to arrive. I looked at the silver tray in my hands. I looked at the beautiful white plates on the table. I realized right then that no matter how many hours I worked or how many lives I helped change in this house, I would always just be the girl holding the tray. I swallowed the painful lump in my throat. I did not correct my father. I never corrected him. It took too much emotional energy, and it always ended with him telling me I was being entirely too sensitive. I simply turned around and I walked back into the kitchen. I let the door swing shut behind me, cutting off the sound of my father bragging about David. I leaned against the cool granite counter. I closed my eyes and I took a shaky breath. I told myself to just get through the night. Just serve the dinner, wash the heavy dishes, and go home to my quiet apartment. That was my defined role. That was all I was ever expected to do. The doorbell rang again, sharp and loud over the dull hum of conversation. I heard David walk toward the front hall. The heavy oak door opened and a sudden quiet fell over the crowded living room. Everyone turned to look. I stayed in the kitchen for a moment, wiping my damp hands on a small towel. I picked up the heavy crystal water pitcher and I pushed the swinging door open with my shoulder. David was standing in the entryway with a tall woman by his side. She had dark hair and a kind, open face. She smiled warmly as my father immediately stepped forward to shake her hand. My mother rushed over, offering a bright, nervous greeting. Everyone was completely focused on her. David looked incredibly proud. He placed a hand on her lower back and he said, "Everyone, this is Megan." I stood at the edge of the dining room holding the heavy pitcher. I waited for the introductions to finish so I could step in and fill the empty water glasses. David walked Megan around the room. He introduced her to our aunt and our uncle and a few family friends. She was polite and genuine. She laughed at my father and his loud jokes. She seemed like a truly good person. Then David turned toward the dining room. He saw me standing there waiting patiently like the hired help. He gestured casually in my direction. He said, "And that is my sister Jessica." Megan turned to look at me. Her polite smile was still on her face. But then her eyes met mine and something entirely unexpected happened. The polite smile faltered just for a fraction of a second. Her expression shifted. Her eyes widened slightly and her posture changed. She was not looking at me the way everyone else in this house looked at me. She was looking at me with intense recognition. She knew exactly who I was, and I could tell instantly that she did not know me from a passing family photograph. She knew me from somewhere real and somewhere incredibly difficult. She took a step away from David, and she walked directly toward me. She stopped right in front of me, ignoring the beautiful table and the expensive crystal. She looked at the heavy pitcher in my hands, and then she looked directly at my tired face. Her voice was incredibly soft and very careful when she spoke. She said, "It is an absolute honor to finally meet you, Jessica." The word honor hung in the air, heavy and deeply unfamiliar in this house. She reached out and she took my free hand, squeezing it with a firm, intentional warmth. She did not say anything else. She did not explain herself to the quiet room. She just held my hand and she looked at me with deep, undeniable gratitude. I felt a strange tightness in my throat. I managed to whisper, "It is nice to meet you too." David quickly ushered her toward the table, eager to start the important dinner. I stood there completely frozen. I looked down at my hand. The warmth of her grasp lingered. I realized in that quiet moment that I was not invisible to everyone in the world. I was only invisible here in the house where I had grown up. I turned around and I walked slowly back into the empty kitchen. I set the heavy crystal pitcher down on the cold granite counter. I looked down at the soft linen apron tied securely around my waist. The apron that marked me as the server, the cleaner, the silent background character of my own family. I reached behind my back and I untied the tight knot. I pulled the apron over my head. I folded it carefully into a neat square, and I placed it gently on the counter. I took a slow, deep breath, and I felt the heavy weight of 30 years begin to lift. I was not going to serve them tonight. I pushed the swinging door open, and I walked back into the dining room. My hands were completely empty. The family was already finding their seats, scraping the heavy wooden chairs against the hard floor, settling in for the long meal. I walked quietly to the far end of the table. I stood next to the small space, the empty space without a beautifully written name card, and I pulled out my chair. I sat down. It sounds like such a simple thing to sit down at a family dinner table, but in my house it was a profound break in the established system. My mother looked at me, her eyes darting quickly to my waist, noticing the missing linen apron. She opened her mouth to speak, but she closed it again, clearly unsure of how to process this sudden change in the script. The steaming bowls of food were already on the table, placed there earlier by me, but there were no silver serving spoons in the mashed potatoes, and the warm gravy boat was still resting out of sight on the kitchen counter. Usually, I would be the one hovering behind the chairs, making sure everything was perfectly distributed before I ever took a bite. Tonight, I rested my hands in my lap, and I simply waited. My father sat at the head of the table, entirely focused on David and Megan. He picked up his fork, realized his plate was completely empty, and looked down the long table toward me. He said, "Jessica, we are missing the gravy and someone needs to pour the red wine." He said it casually, not as a polite request, but as a standard command to the invisible staff. I looked directly at him across the wide expanse of the white tablecloth and the beautiful gold-rimmed plates. I kept my voice perfectly level and very calm. "I said the gravy is on the kitchen counter, Dad." And I stayed seated. A heavy, awkward silence dropped over the table. It was not the comfortable silence of people enjoying a good meal. It was the sharp, confused silence of a machine grinding to a sudden halt. David paused, his hand hovering over his crystal water glass. My aunt stopped talking about her recent winter vacation. Everyone stared at me, waiting for me to laugh or apologize or jump up and immediately fulfill my assigned duty. I did none of those things. I simply sat there breathing steadily, feeling the cool room air on my clothes where the apron used to be. My father frowned, a deep, angry crease forming between his brows. He looked sharply at my mother, silently demanding that she fix this awkward disruption. My mother smiled nervously, a tight, fragile expression taking over her face. She stood up quickly, her chair scraping loudly against the wood, and she practically ran into the kitchen to fetch the missing items. The dinner proceeded, but the familiar rhythm was entirely broken. My mother returned with the gravy, and she poured the wine, her hands shaking slightly from the unusual pressure. I watched her take on the invisible burden, the exact same burden I had carried alone for 30 years. I felt a brief pang of guilt, but I swallowed it down, replacing it with the firm resolve I had found in the quiet kitchen. People started to eat, forcing polite conversation, trying desperately to pretend that everything was perfectly normal. But the absence of my constant motion was a physical presence in the room. When David asked for the salt, he looked directly at me, expecting me to pass it all the way from the other end of the table. I did not move. I looked down at my plate and I took a slow bite of my food. After a long, painful pause, he had to reach awkwardly across his new girlfriend, muttering a quick apology to grab it himself. The water glasses slowly went empty one by one. The empty serving bowls sat awkwardly in the center of the table instead of being quickly cleared away. No one stepped up to manage the flow of the meal because they had never needed to learn how. The friction was palpable, thick, and suffocating. My father grew increasingly irritated, tapping his fingers nervously against the polished wood. He looked at me several times. His eyes narrowed silently, asking what was wrong with me tonight. I did not meet his gaze. I focused entirely on my breathing, slowing everything down. Megan sat quietly beside David, observing the strained, awkward dynamic. She did not ask any questions, but I could feel her eyes on me, watching the silent protest unfold. As the long meal finally ended, the table was a complete disaster. Dirty plates were stacked haphazardly, crumpled napkins were left on empty chairs, and half-empty glasses left wet water rings on the delicate tablecloth. Usually, I would have cleared all of this away before dessert was even mentioned. Tonight, I pushed my chair back and I stood up slowly. My father looked instantly relieved, assuming I was finally returning to my post. He said, "It is about time, Jessica, let us get this terrible mess cleaned up." I looked at the chaotic table, and then I looked calmly at my family. I said, "Excuse me, I need to use the restroom." I walked away, leaving the ruins of the family dinner exactly where they were, a messy monument to a lifetime of unappreciated labor. I stayed in the bathroom for 10 minutes. The house was quiet except for the muffled sounds of awkward conversation downstairs. I looked at myself in the mirror. I looked exactly the same, but I felt entirely different. I washed my hands, drying them slowly on a small hand towel. I walked back out, but I did not go to the dining room. I went straight to the front hall closet. I pulled out my heavy winter coat. The sound of the wooden coat hangers rattling drew my mother out of the living room. She stood in the hallway looking completely bewildered. "You are leaving already?" she asked. Her voice was thin and stretched tight. "The dessert is not even out yet," she added. I slipped my arms into my coat and I buttoned it slowly. "I have an early morning at the clinic tomorrow," I said. It was not a lie, but it was also not the real reason I was leaving. My father appeared behind her, holding an empty coffee cup. He looked at my winter coat and his face hardened instantly. "Who is going to help your mother clean up this terrible mess?" he demanded. He did not ask if I was feeling okay. He did not ask if everything was all right. He asked who was going to do the work because the work was my only real identity in his eyes. I looked at him, feeling a strange sense of profound calm wash over me. "David is here," I said. "Megan is here. You are here. I am sure you can all figure it out." I did not wait for his shocked response. I opened the heavy oak door and I walked out into the cold night air. I walked down the long driveway and I got into my car. When I started the engine, I did not look back at the bright windows of the house. I drove the 2 hours back to my quiet apartment in the city. The drive felt entirely different this time. The crushing weight of constant exhaustion was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. I slept heavily that night, deeply and completely for the very first time in years. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing continuously on my nightstand. The bright screen illuminated the dark room. It was the family group text. My father had sent a long message at 7 in the morning. He was complaining about how late they had to stay up washing the crystal glasses. He said the kitchen was a complete disaster after I abandoned them. He said I was acting incredibly selfish and ruining a perfectly good evening. My mother chimed in right after, saying she hoped I was not coming down with a cold, trying desperately to find a medical excuse for my sudden change in behavior. I lay in bed reading the demanding messages, and I felt a familiar pang of guilt try to settle heavy in my chest. But then I thought about the empty space at the beautiful table. I thought about the invisible apron. I put my phone on silent and I placed it face down on the wooden nightstand. I did not reply. I got up. I made myself a strong cup of coffee and I got ready for work. The clinic is a bright, colorful space filled with soft mats and therapeutic equipment and the sounds of children trying their absolute hardest. When I walked through the double glass doors, the receptionist smiled warmly, and she handed me my schedule for the day. This was my real world. This was the place where my actions actually mattered. My first patient was a small boy named Leo. He was 5 years old, and he had been in a severe car accident several months ago. He was learning how to use his left arm again. When I walked into the therapy room, he was sitting on a large blue mat, looking incredibly frustrated. He was trying to stack wooden blocks, but his small hand kept shaking, knocking the tall tower down over and over again. I got down on the floor, sitting cross-legged right beside him. I did not take over the task. I did not do the hard work for him. I placed my hand gently over his trembling hand, steadying his small fingers. We breathed together in and out, slowing everything down. "Let us try one more time," I whispered. Together we picked up a red wooden block, and we placed it carefully on top of the precarious tower. It wobbled slightly, but it stayed. Leo looked at me, his eyes wide with sudden joy. He smiled a huge, radiant smile, and he threw his good arm around my neck. "You did it, Leo," I said softly. I spent the entire morning on the floor, holding small hands supporting weak limbs, cheering for quiet victories that most people would never even notice. A single step, a lifted head, a tightened grip. These were not loud, shiny achievements, but they were monumental triumphs. I did not check my phone a single time. I completely ignored the loud demands of my father and the anxious texts from my mother. I was too busy doing the very thing they called a little volunteer project. I was busy rebuilding lives one tiny movement at a time. The stark contrast between my family and my work had never felt so painfully clear. In that loud house, I was practically invisible, expected to carry the emotional and physical load without a single word of thanks. But here on this soft blue mat, I was absolutely essential. I was seen. I was valued. I realized holding Leo and his small hand that I could no longer accept being treated like a shadow in my own family. Not when I knew exactly what it felt like to be a guiding light for someone else. At noon, the busy clinic finally grew quiet. The children went to their separate rooms for a mandatory rest period. I sat in the small staff break room completely alone. I opened a plastic container of leftover salad from the night before. I looked at the bright green lettuce, and my mind drifted inevitably back to the house I had just left. The quiet hum of the clinic refrigerator sounded exactly like the distant murmur of my parents talking in their kitchen, a sound I had memorized over 30 long years. I took a slow bite of my food, and a specific memory washed over me, sharp and incredibly clear. It was 15 years ago. David had just received a rejection letter from his absolute top choice university. My father was entirely devastated. He paced the living room for hours, his voice thick with loud anger and heavy disappointment. My mother shut herself in her dark bedroom, unable to cope with the sudden fracture in their perfect golden plan. Nobody checked on David. He was sitting alone on the back porch, staring blankly at the grass, looking completely lost. I was only 16 years old. I went into the quiet kitchen, I made him a simple sandwich, and I carried it out to the cold porch. I sat right beside him in the fading evening light. I told him it was going to be perfectly fine. I told him he was smart and capable and that one single letter did not define his entire life. He cried softly, and I held his shaking shoulder until he finally stopped. The next morning, my parents acted like the painful rejection had never even happened. They pivoted immediately to his second-choice school, celebrating it loudly, as if it had been the master plan all along. Nobody mentioned the silent tears on the dark porch. Nobody thanked me for holding the fragile pieces of our family together while the adults completely fell apart. That silently became my unspoken job. I was the emotional safety net strung quietly beneath the heavy tightrope they all walked. I pushed my cold salad around with a plastic fork. Another distant memory surfaced, pushing its brutal way through the quiet break room. It was my own college graduation day. I had just finished my grueling degree in physical therapy. I was so incredibly proud of the hard work I had done. When I finished, I washed the knife, I wiped the counter clean, and I put the box away in the refrigerator. I went back into the loud dining room, and I gently asked David if he needed anything else to drink. That was the established pattern woven so deeply into our daily lives that we could not even see the heavy threads anymore. Their pain was always a massive crisis that required an immediate all-hands-on-deck response. My pain and my joy were simply minor inconveniences that needed to be managed quietly or entirely ignored. A kind coworker named Rachel walked into the break room, gently interrupting my heavy thoughts. She opened the refrigerator to grab a cold bottle of water. She turned to me and she smiled warmly. She asked, "How was your weekend, Jessica?" I looked at her familiar face. I could have told her about the tense dinner. I could have told her about the heavy apron and the empty table and the long drive home in the absolute dark. But I did not. The ingrained habit of silence was still incredibly strong. I just smiled politely back at her, and I said it was fine, Rachel. It was just a normal family dinner. She nodded slowly, unscrewing the cap of her water bottle, completely unaware of the massive lie I had just told. She asked if I was ready for the afternoon therapy session. I told her I was. I threw my half-eaten salad into the trash can. I washed my hands at the small sink, letting the cold water run over my tired wrists, grounding myself firmly back in the present moment. I was not that 16-year-old girl anymore carrying sandwiches to sad boys on cold porches. I was not the invisible graduate eating solitary cake over a lonely sink. I took a deep breath, smoothing down my blue scrub top. I walked out of the quiet break room, leaving those heavy memories exactly where they belonged, and I headed back down the bright hallway to help people who actually needed me to be strong. The rest of the week passed in a blur of quiet focus at the clinic. I kept my phone on silent during my shifts. I did not answer the occasional cautious calls from my mother. I knew exactly what she wanted. She wanted to pretend the awkward Sunday dinner had never happened. She wanted me to apologize for leaving early, and then she wanted us to go right back to the way things always were. On Thursday afternoon, I was sitting at my small wooden desk updating patient charts. My phone buzzed loudly against the wood. I looked down at the bright screen. It was a very long text message from my father. I picked the phone up and I started to read. He did not ask how my week was going. He did not mention Sunday night. He simply wrote, "Your mother is turning 60 in 3 weeks. We need to do something very special for her big milestone." He told me to book the large private room at her favorite Italian restaurant. He told me to order a huge chocolate cake from the expensive bakery across town. He told me to make sure I invited Aunt Susan and Uncle Robert and all of her old friends from the local tennis club. He ended the long, demanding message by saying, "Send me the final details by Monday morning so I can put it on my calendar." I sat there holding the cold phone in my hand. I stared at his words for a very long time. For the past 15 years, I had planned every single birthday and every major anniversary and every holiday gathering. I was the one who remembered the dates. I was the one who made the difficult reservations. I was the one who drove across town to pick up the expensive cakes, carefully holding the white cardboard boxes in my lap so the delicate frosting would not smear. I did all the invisible labor, and when the party finally started, my father would stand up, raise a glass, and take all the credit for a wonderful evening. A familiar heavy pressure settled right in the center of my chest. It was the physical weight of deep obligation. My brain automatically started making a mental list of things to do. Call the restaurant. Check the bakery hours. Find the phone numbers for the tennis club friends. It was a well-worn pathway in my mind, a smooth, deep groove carved by years of constant compliance. It would be so incredibly easy to just type OK and start making the phone calls. It would keep the fragile peace. It would stop the inevitable conflict before it even started. But then I thought about David. David managed multi-million-dollar accounts at his corporate job. He organized massive charity golf tournaments for his wealthy clients. He was more than capable of calling a local Italian restaurant and ordering a chocolate cake. But my father would never ask David to do those mundane things. David and his time was considered far too valuable. My time spent helping injured children walk again was viewed as entirely expendable. That quiet realization stripped away the last remaining shred of my guilt. I thought about the heavy linen apron. I thought about the empty space at the beautiful dining table. I thought about Leo, the little boy at the clinic learning how to stack his wooden blocks without any help from me. I realized that if I planned this birthday party, I was putting the apron right back on. I was telling my father that my sudden departure on Sunday was just a momentary tantrum and that I was still the exact same compliant girl I had always been. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cool clinic air fill my lungs. I tapped the screen and I opened the keyboard. I did not write a long emotional paragraph. I did not explain how tired I was or how unfair his constant demands felt. I knew he would not really read those words anyway. He would only scan the message for the specific information he actually wanted. So I kept my response very simple and perfectly polite. I typed, "I am so glad we are celebrating Mom and her 60th birthday. I am unfortunately too busy at the clinic right now to plan the party. David is great at organizing events. I am sure he can handle the restaurant reservations and the cake. Let me know what time I should show up." I read the short message 3 times. My thumb hovered nervously over the send button. My heart was beating entirely too fast in my chest. This was not just declining a simple task. This was resigning from my lifelong job as the family manager. I closed my eyes and I pressed send. I placed the phone face down on the desk. I pushed my chair back and I walked over to the small window. I looked out at the busy street below. I waited for the immediate explosion. I waited for the angry phone call. But the phone just sat there completely silent. The silence felt massive and incredibly heavy. I knew exactly what was happening in my parents' house right now. My father was staring at his phone entirely confused, trying to process a firm boundary he had never encountered before. He was probably showing the message to my mother, asking her what on earth was wrong with me. He would expect her to call me to smooth things over and to gently force me back into my designated place. I pictured the two of them standing in their immaculate kitchen, completely paralyzed by a simple task they had outsourced to me for over a decade. They would have to look up the restaurant phone number. They would have to figure out how many people could fit at a large table. They would have to do the actual mental labor of caring for someone else. I did not feel guilty. For the first time in my entire life, I felt a strange, thrilling sense of pure freedom. I had finally handed the heavy burden back to the people who were supposed to be carrying it. I turned away from the bright window and I went back to my patient charts. I picked up my pen and I started writing down notes for Leo and his next therapy session. My hand was completely steady. The world had not ended just because I said no. The old family system was finally starting to break, and I was not going to rush in to save it. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange, unprecedented silence. My phone did not ring with frantic updates. My father did not text me to double-check the reservation time. I went to work at the clinic every single day. I helped Leo learn how to hold a blue plastic spoon. I helped a little girl named Maya take 3 unassisted steps across the soft blue mat. I poured my energy into the children, and I left the adults to manage their own lives. It was surprisingly peaceful, but it was also a heavy weighting kind of peace. I knew the storm was coming. The fragile family structure was completely dependent on my invisible labor, and it was only a matter of time before a critical piece gave way. The crack finally happened 3 days before the birthday dinner. I was walking out of the clinic carrying my heavy work bag when my phone started vibrating violently in my pocket. I pulled it out and I saw David and his name flashing brightly on the screen. He had not called me in over 6 months. He usually just texted a quick generic message on major holidays. I stood in the warm parking lot and I stared at the bright phone. I knew exactly why he was calling. I took a slow breath, bracing myself for the familiar panic, and I answered the call.
"Jessica,"
he said, his voice loud and incredibly stressed.
"Thank God you answered. I need you to do me a massive favor right now."
He did not say hello. He did not ask how I was doing. He immediately assumed his usual position of authority, demanding that I fix whatever he had broken. I leaned against the warm metal of my car door.
I said, "Hello, David. What is going on?" "It is about Mom and her party,"
he said, his words rushing out in a frantic blur. "Dad told me to order the chocolate cake from that fancy bakery on the west side. He said you always get the triple chocolate one. Well, I called them 20 minutes ago, and they said they need a full 5 days notice for custom orders. They completely refused to make it by Saturday. They said they are entirely booked up." He paused, taking a sharp, angry breath.
"It is completely ridiculous," he complained. "I offered to pay double, but they still said no."
I closed my eyes and I pictured the busy bakery. I knew their strict policies by heart. I had always called 2 full weeks in advance, setting reminders on my phone so I would never miss the important deadline. I had managed that specific detail perfectly for a decade. I held the phone to my ear and I listened to my brother panic over a simple cake. "So, what are you going to do?" I asked quietly.
"That is why I am calling you,"
he said, sounding genuinely confused by my simple question.
"You know the people at that bakery, right? You have been going there for years. I need you to call them and use your connections. Tell them it is an absolute emergency. Or if they really will not do it, I need you to find another bakery that can make a decent chocolate cake by Saturday afternoon. I have massive back-to-back meetings all day tomorrow, and I simply do not have the time to deal with this right now." He spoke with absolute certainty. He fully expected me to drop everything, make the frantic phone calls, and save the day. He expected me to act as his personal assistant, just like I had always done. He wanted me to absorb his failure and magically turn it into a sudden success. I looked out across the busy parking lot. A mother was helping her young son into a blue minivan. The sky was turning a soft, pale orange. I felt a familiar, powerful urge to just say yes. It would take me 30 minutes to solve his problem. I knew 3 other bakeries that could rush a good cake. It would be so incredibly easy to rescue him, but rescuing him meant betraying myself. It meant proving my father right. It meant confirming that my boundaries were entirely fake and that I was still the invisible safety net waiting quietly beneath them. I shifted my weight against the car. I spoke very slowly and very clearly. "I am sorry, David," I said. "I do not have any special connections at that bakery. I just always called them 2 weeks early." There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line. "What do you mean?" he finally asked, his voice dropping into a low, irritated tone. "Are you seriously telling me you will not help with this? It is Mom and her 60th birthday, Jessica. You cannot just abandon the family like this over some petty argument you had with Dad." "I am not abandoning anyone," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly calm. "I am just holding my firm boundary. I told Dad I was too busy to plan the party. You willingly took over the planning. Ordering the cake is part of the planning. I have a full day of patience tomorrow, and I cannot spend my breaks calling bakeries for you." He let out a loud, frustrated sigh. "This is unbelievable," he muttered. "You are being completely unreasonable right now. I do not have time for this, Jessica. Then I suggest you buy a nice cake from the local grocery store, I said. I am sure Mom will love whatever you bring. I will see you on Saturday, David. I pulled the phone away from my ear and I pressed the red button to end the call. I stood in the parking lot holding the silent phone and my hands were shaking slightly. I had never spoken to my brother that way in my entire life. I had never let him face the natural consequences of his own mistakes. He was angry, and he was stressed, and he was entirely responsible for his own failure. I opened my car door and I got inside. I put my heavy bag on the passenger seat. I started the engine and I pulled out onto the busy street. The family system was officially faltering. The golden boy had dropped the ball and the invisible girl was absolutely refusing to pick it up. The birthday dinner on Saturday was going to be incredibly difficult, but for the first time in 30 years, the difficulty was not going to be my fault. The very next evening, I was sitting on my small velvet sofa reading a quiet book. My apartment was calm and perfectly still. Then my phone rang again, breaking the peaceful silence. It was my mother. I stared at the bright screen, watching her name flash in the dim light. I knew David had complained to them. I knew the narrative was already firmly set, and I was the clear villain in their newly written story. I took a deep, steadying breath, and I answered the call. "Hello, Mom," I said. "Jessica, what on earth is going on with you?" she asked immediately. Her voice was thin and trembling slightly, carrying a heavy mixture of confusion and mild defensiveness. She did not say hello. She just launched right into the designated family crisis. She said David called us last night in an absolute panic. He said you completely refused to help him with the birthday cake. I placed my open book gently on the wooden coffee table. I said I did not refuse to help him, Mom. I just told him I could not do the actual planning for him. He is the one organizing the party this year. My mother sighed loudly, a sharp, exasperated sound that echoed through the small phone speaker. She said, "But you always handle the cake, Jessica. You know exactly who to call and what to say to them. Your brother is incredibly busy at his new job. He does not have the extra time to sit on the phone arguing with difficult bakery managers. You know how demanding his corporate schedule is." I leaned back against the soft velvet cushions. I looked at the dark window across my living room. I said my job is very demanding too, Mom. I work full-time at the clinic. I cannot plan a major event during my working hours when I have patients depending on me. There was a long, heavy pause on the line. I could hear my father talking loudly in the background. He was standing close to her, telling her exactly what to say next. I heard him mutter the word selfish, and I heard him say the word difficult. My mother cleared her throat, clearly uncomfortable with the tension, but entirely willing to deliver his harsh message. She said your father thinks you are doing this on purpose, Jessica. He thinks you are just trying to punish us because you were in a bad mood at Sunday dinner. He says you are being incredibly stubborn and intentionally disrupting the peace of our family. The peace of our family. The heavy phrase hung in the silent air of my living room. I realized in that quiet, solitary moment what family peace actually meant to them. It simply meant that I carried all the collective stress so they never had to feel any of it. It meant that my absolute exhaustion was the required currency to buy their daily comfort. Their peace was built entirely on my silent labor. I kept my voice perfectly level. I said, I am not punishing anyone, Mom. I am just stepping back to breathe. I cannot be the only person who manages the emotional load of this entire family. But we do not know how to do the specific things you do, she pleaded, her voice rising in genuine frustration. She sounded truly lost, like a passenger on a comfortable ship who suddenly realized the quiet captain had walked away from the steering wheel.
She said your father spent an entire hour trying to figure out the restaurant deposit today. He was so frustrated he almost canceled the whole thing. And David is completely overwhelmed with the details. Why are you making everything so terribly hard for us, Jessica? I closed my eyes and I gently pinched the bridge of my nose. I wanted to scream into the phone. I wanted to ask her why it was perfectly acceptable for me to be completely overwhelmed for 30 long years, but an absolute tragedy when David was mildly stressed for a single afternoon. I wanted to ask her why my father could successfully manage a complex retirement portfolio, but suddenly lost his entire mind over a simple restaurant deposit. But I knew those logical questions would not pierce their thick defensive armor. They were completely insulated by their own established reality. In their minds, I was the one breaking the beautiful working machine. They could not see that the machine was breaking my back. I kept my voice very low and steady. I said it is hard for you right now because you have never had to do it before. It has always been this hard, Mom. You just never saw the difficult parts because I hid them from you. I handled the phone calls and the stress and the impossible deadlines all by myself in the dark. I am simply not hiding it anymore. My mother was completely quiet. The silence stretched out over the phone line, thick and deeply uncomfortable. Then she said, "You are changing, Jessica. I do not understand this harsh new version of you. You used to be so sweet and so incredibly helpful. Now you are just causing unnecessary drama." The word drama felt like a sharp, sudden slap across the face. They had taken my lifelong quiet sacrifice and my desperate plea for basic respect, and they had comfortably labeled it as petty drama. They were perfectly willing to accept my silent labor, but the moment I asked for basic equity, I was suddenly a terrible problem. I looked around my quiet, safe apartment. I looked at my comfortable space and the peaceful life I had built entirely on my own merits. I realized I could not ever force them to see my true worth. I could only refuse to participate in my own devaluation. I said, "I love you, Mom. I will see you at the restaurant on Saturday. I hope David finds a wonderful birthday cake for you." I did not wait for her to argue or for my father to yell into the background. I gently ended the call. I set the phone down on the smooth wooden table. My hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline, but my chest felt incredibly light and completely clear. They were deeply confused and they were very angry, but they were finally feeling the actual heavy weight of the family. The invisible burden was no longer mine to carry alone. The next day was Friday, the quiet day right before the dreaded birthday dinner. I was sitting at a small corner table in my favorite coffee shop, watching the heavy rain hit the large glass window. My phone buzzed gently against the dark wood of the table. I expected another angry message from David or a passive-aggressive note from my mother, but the bright screen showed an entirely unknown number. I unlocked the phone and I read the short text message. It said, "Hello, Jessica. This is Megan David and his girlfriend. I was hoping I could call you for a few minutes if you are free." I stared at the glowing screen. I had not spoken to Megan since that incredibly awkward moment in my parents' dining room. I felt a sudden spike of nervous anxiety. I wondered if David had asked her to intervene to play the smooth peacemaker and drag me right back into my designated family role. But I remembered the way she had looked at me with that deep, genuine recognition. I took a slow sip of my warm coffee and I texted back. I said, "You can call me right now." The phone rang almost instantly. I picked it up and I brought it carefully to my ear. "Hello, Megan," I said, keeping my voice very neutral and perfectly calm. "Hi, Jessica," she replied. Her voice was incredibly soft and very careful, just like it had been in the loud dining room. She said, "I am so sorry to bother you on a Friday evening. I know things are very tense with your family right now. David has been pacing around his apartment stressing over a birthday cake for the last 2 days. I let out a small, unexpected laugh. I said I suppose he is finally learning how difficult event planning can actually be. He is completely losing his mind, she said, letting out a warm, genuine laugh of her own. But that is not why I am calling you. I did not call to fix David and his sudden problems. I called because I wanted to talk to you about Chloe. The sudden mention of that specific name made my chest tighten. Chloe was a bright, fiercely independent little girl. She was 7 years old when she first came to our clinic. I remembered her small face contorted in angry defiance and deep fear after the terrible car accident that had severely damaged her legs. Megan took a slow, deep breath over the phone. She said David does not know I am calling you tonight. He does not know the full story about Chloe either. When I met him, I just told him my little sister had been in a bad accident and that she did physical therapy at the clinic downtown. I did not tell him that you were the specific therapist who saved her life. I did not realize you were his sister until I walked into that dining room and saw you standing there holding a water pitcher like the hired help. I listened quietly, watching the heavy raindrops slide down the bright coffee shop window. I said Chloe was a very brave little girl, Megan. It was an absolute honor to work with her. She was not brave at first, Megan said, her voice cracking very slightly over the line. She was incredibly angry and completely terrified. My parents were entirely devastated. We spent weeks in that sterile hospital watching her refuse to speak and refuse to move. The doctors told us she might never walk unassisted again. And then we brought her to your bright, colorful clinic. I remembered those early difficult days perfectly. Chloe would throw her small plastic blocks across the quiet room. She would scream and she would cry and she would refuse to participate in any of the healing exercises. Other therapists had completely given up on her, saying she was far too difficult and entirely uncooperative. Megan continued, her voice thick with heavy emotion. She said you did not give up Jessica. You sat on the hard floor with her every single Tuesday and Thursday for 6 long months. You let her yell. You let her throw things. You stayed perfectly calm and you stayed right beside her until she finally felt safe enough to try. I closed my eyes, letting the powerful memory wash over me. I remembered the exact afternoon Chloe finally let me guide her weak legs. I remembered the fierce, determined look in her bright blue eyes. Megan said the day she took her very first steps on the soft blue mat, she did not walk toward my mother. She did not walk toward me. She looked right past us and she walked directly into your open arms. You gave my sister her entire life back, Jessica. You gave my family our hope back. A hot tear slipped quietly down my cheek. I wiped it away quickly with the back of my hand. I said thank you for telling me that, Megan. You have no idea how much I needed to hear those specific words this week. Megan sighed softly into the phone. She said I sat at that beautiful dinner table on Sunday, and I listened to your father call your work a little volunteer thing. I watched your brother completely ignore you while you served everyone their hot food. I was absolutely horrified, Jessica. I could not understand how they could be so completely blind. They have a real-life hero sitting quietly in their kitchen and they treat her like she does not even matter. The stark contrast was incredibly painful, but also deeply validating. Here was a virtual stranger, someone who had only known my family for a few short hours, seeing the exact toxic dynamic that had suffocated me for 30 years. She said, I do not know what happened between you and David regarding this upcoming birthday party, but I want you to know that I truly see you, Jessica. I know exactly what you are worth, even if your own family completely refuses to acknowledge it. I held the small phone tightly.
The heavy dark cloud that had been hovering over me all week finally broke apart. I felt a sudden surge of quiet, powerful strength. I said, "Thank you, Megan. Truly thank you. I will see you at the restaurant tomorrow night." We said our gentle goodbyes and I ended the call. I sat in the busy coffee shop for a very long time watching the bright city lights blur in the heavy rain. I was no longer afraid of the massive birthday dinner. I was no longer dreading the sharp comments or the heavy sighs of disappointment. I knew exactly who I was and I knew exactly what I was capable of doing. The invisible girl was officially gone and she was never going to come back. Saturday evening arrived, bringing a cold, relentless rain. I drove slowly through the busy city streets heading toward the expensive Italian restaurant. I parked my car, I grabbed my simple umbrella, and I walked through the heavy wooden doors. Usually, I would have arrived an hour early. I would have checked the table arrangements, and I would have placed the small party favors, and I would have confirmed the complicated wine list with the busy waiter. Tonight, I arrived exactly on time, walking in simply as a guest. The lobby was incredibly crowded, filled with loud voices and wet coats. I scanned the chaotic room and I immediately spotted my family. They were standing near the busy host stand, looking entirely lost and deeply uncomfortable. David was standing at the front, arguing loudly with the young hostess. His face was flushed and his expensive suit looked slightly rumpled. My father was pacing right behind him, tapping his watch, looking furious. My mother was standing quietly near the wall, trying desperately to smile at Aunt Susan and Uncle Robert, but her eyes were darting anxiously around the crowded space. The smooth, effortless operation they were entirely used to was completely gone. Without my invisible labor, the event was already unraveling. I closed my wet umbrella and I walked calmly over to the tense group. I said, "Hello everyone, happy birthday, Mom." My mother turned to me looking incredibly relieved, as if the official problem solver had finally arrived. She reached out and she pulled me into a tight, anxious hug. She whispered, "Thank goodness you are here, Jessica. David is having a terrible time with the table." I hugged her back gently, but I did not step forward to fix the chaotic situation. I stayed right beside her, keeping my hands completely empty. My father saw me, and his angry expression deepened. He pointed a sharp finger toward the busy host stand. He said, "They do not have our private room ready, Jessica. They are saying David only booked a standard table in the loud dining room. Go talk to the manager right now and fix this ridiculous mistake." He spoke with his usual absolute authority, fully expecting me to obey his direct command. He did not care that David had made the actual error. He only cared that I was suddenly available to clean up the massive mess. I looked at my father, keeping my breathing very slow and perfectly even. I said, "David made the reservation, Dad. He needs to speak with the manager himself." "I am sure he can figure it out." My father stared at me, his mouth opening slightly in complete shock. Aunt Susan looked back and forth between us, sensing the heavy, unusual tension. My father said, "Do not be difficult tonight, Jessica. It is your mother and her special birthday." He used guilt as a quick weapon, aiming it right at my deepest vulnerabilities. I felt the familiar heavy pull of family obligation. The quiet voice in my head urged me to just step in and save the ruined evening. It would take me 5 minutes to negotiate with the busy manager, but I looked at David arguing pointlessly with the young hostess instead of apologizing for his own mistake. I looked at my father, expecting me to automatically absorb the painful stress. I stood my ground, leaning casually against the cool brick wall. I said, "I am not being difficult, Dad. I am just waiting for the table like everyone else." David finally walked back over to the group looking completely exhausted. He ran a heavy hand through his dark hair. He said they cannot give us the private room. They gave it away to another large party because I did not call to confirm the final head count on Thursday. He looked directly at me, his eyes full of sharp, angry resentment. He said they put us at a long table in the main dining area right next to the loud kitchen doors. It is a complete disaster. My mother let out a small, disappointed sigh. She had been talking about the beautiful, quiet, private room for over a month. My father glared at David, shaking his head in loud disgust. He said, "You had one simple job, David." David immediately turned his defensive anger toward me. He said, "Well, if Jessica had just helped me like she always does, this never would have happened." He blamed me for his own failure, unable to accept the basic consequence of his own poor planning. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself against his ridiculous accusation. I simply looked at him and I said, "You are a very successful manager, David. You handle complicated corporate accounts every single day. I think you can handle calling a local restaurant to confirm a basic head count." Megan was standing quietly behind David. She met my eyes and she gave me a small, encouraging nod. She saw the deeply unfair dynamic playing out clearly in the crowded lobby. The young hostess walked over carrying a stack of large menus. She forced a polite, strained smile. She said, "Your table is finally ready, sir." She led our tense, unhappy group through the incredibly loud, crowded dining room. We walked past beautiful, quiet booths, heading all the way to the back of the chaotic restaurant. They seated us at a long, wobbly table located directly across from the swinging kitchen doors. Waiters rushed loudly past us carrying heavy trays of hot food. The noise was absolutely deafening. We all sat down, scraping the heavy wooden chairs against the hard floor. The mood was incredibly sour. The beautiful, elegant birthday dinner they had imagined was completely ruined. My father picked up his large menu, glaring angrily at the laminated pages. My mother looked close to sad tears. David sat stiffly in his chair, completely furious, radiating defensive anger. I sat quietly near the end of the long table, folding my white linen napkin into a neat square. The system was entirely broken, and the heavy friction was practically burning the air around us. The uncomfortable reality was finally exposed, and nobody knew how to handle the painful truth. The waiter arrived at our chaotic table carrying a small electronic tablet. He looked completely rushed and highly stressed. The restaurant was incredibly loud, making it very difficult to hear anything. My father tossed his large menu onto the table, looking deeply annoyed. He said this menu is entirely in Italian, and I cannot read a single word of it. He looked directly at David, expecting the successful son to confidently take charge of the difficult situation. David picked up the heavy menu, scanning the unfamiliar words, looking completely out of his depth. He usually relied on me to translate the complex dishes and to remember Aunt Susan and her severe garlic allergy and to pick the perfect red wine that my father actually liked. David cleared his throat loudly, trying desperately to sound authoritative. He ordered a basic salad for himself, stumbling nervously over the Italian pronunciation. The rushed waiter looked confused, asking a quick question about the house dressing. David frowned completely, losing his false confidence. He looked across the wide table directly at me. He let out a small, tired sigh, shifting right back into his comfortable, familiar role. He said, "Jessica, just tell him what we all want. You always order the good appetizers for the whole table, and you know exactly which wine Dad actually drinks." He smiled a tight, forced smile, attempting to smooth over the heavy tension from the crowded lobby. He said, "Let us just drop this silly protest for tonight, okay? Mom is very upset, and you have made your point loud and clear. Just order the food, Jessica, so we can salvage this terrible evening." He inadvertently sided entirely with our father. He framed my lifetime of silent exhaustion as a petty temporary protest. He truly believed that my firm boundary was just a bad mood, a brief interruption in the established family service. He expected me to just pick up the heavy menu, smile politely at the rushed waiter, and smoothly erase the incredible awkwardness he had personally created. My father nodded in strong agreement, tapping his fingers impatiently on the wooden table. He said, "Listen to your brother Jessica. Stop acting like a spoiled child and make yourself useful for once." The incredibly loud noise of the crowded restaurant suddenly seemed to completely fade away. I looked at the heavy menu resting near my empty water glass. I looked at my mother staring anxiously at her folded hands, desperately hoping I would simply comply. I looked at David waiting impatiently for me to rescue his failed dinner. And then I looked directly at my father. The deep tension in my chest did not explode into hot anger. It settled into a cold, devastating clarity. I did not raise my voice, but I spoke with a quiet, absolute firmness that cut right through the surrounding noise. "I am not making a point, David," I said, keeping my hands perfectly still in my lap. "I am completely finished." I looked around the long, wobbly table. I said, "For 15 years, I have planned every single birthday and every major holiday in this exact family. I ordered the expensive cakes, and I made the difficult reservations, and I cleaned the dirty kitchens while you all drank red wine in the living room." I looked at my father holding his sharp, angry gaze. I said I wore the linen apron, and I served the hot food, and I made sure every single detail was absolutely perfect, so you could stand up and take all the credit. My father opened his mouth to interrupt me, his face turning a dark, angry red. I did not let him speak. I kept my voice perfectly steady and entirely calm. I said, "I do not expect a shiny metal dad, but I expect to be seen as a real human being and not just the invisible help. You sit there and you call my professional career a little volunteer project because it does not make you look important to your wealthy friends. You treat David like a golden king, and you treat me like a convenient appliance. You only notice I am in the room when your water glass is totally empty or when your dinner reservation is completely ruined." The entire table went absolutely silent. The waiter, sensing the heavy, incredibly uncomfortable family drama, quietly stepped back and disappeared into the loud crowd. He opened his mouth, preparing to deliver a harsh reprimand, preparing to put me right back in my small box. But before he could speak a single word, Megan leaned forward. She placed her hands flat on the wooden table, and she looked directly at my father. She did not look intimidated or nervous. She looked incredibly steady. She said, "Excuse me, sir, but you need to stop talking right now." My father blinked, entirely taken aback. He was not used to being interrupted, especially not by a young woman he barely knew. He said, "This is a private family matter, Megan. It is not private anymore," she said, her clear voice carrying easily over the clatter of the busy dining room. She looked at David, and then she looked right back at my father. She said, "I have sat quietly, and I have watched the two of you treat Jessica like absolute dirt. I watched it at the Sunday dinner, and I am watching it again tonight. You sit there and you call her a spoiled child. You call her work a little volunteer project. You have absolutely no idea who is sitting at this table with you." David reached out gently, touching her arm, trying to calm her down. He said, "Megan, please do not get involved in this." She pulled her arm away, keeping her eyes firmly fixed on my father. She said, "I am already involved, David. I have been involved for over 2 years. She took a slow, deep breath, steadying her emotions. She said my little sister Chloe was in a terrible car accident. She was only 7 years old. Her legs were completely crushed. The surgeon saved her life,
but they told my parents she would likely never walk on her own again. The table went perfectly still. Aunt Susan covered her mouth with her hand. My mother stopped crying, completely captivated by the sudden tragic story. Megan continued, her voice filled with a raw, aching pain. She said we were entirely broken. Chloe was so angry and so completely terrified. She gave up. She refused to do the hospital therapy. She screamed and she threw things, and the hospital staff simply labeled her as non-compliant. They told us there was nothing more they could do. And then we found the pediatric clinic across town. We found Jessica. She turned her head slightly, looking right at me. Her eyes were shining with unshed tears. She looked back at my father, and her voice grew stronger, ringing with absolute conviction. She said your daughter did not sit in a comfortable office. She got down on the hard floor. She sat with my screaming, terrified sister for 2 full hours every single Tuesday and every single Thursday. She did that for 6 long months. When Chloe threw plastic blocks at her, Jessica just picked them up. When Chloe cried, Jessica sat quietly beside her and breathed with her. She never rushed her. She never made her feel broken. My father was staring at Megan, his jaw completely rigid. He had no prepared script for this. He had no ready defense against the absolute truth. Megan leaned in closer, her voice dropping into a fierce, intense whisper that somehow filled the entire space. She said one afternoon, after 6 months of grueling, exhausting work, my sister stood up. She let go of the parallel bars, and she took 3 independent steps. She did not walk toward my crying mother. She walked directly into Jessica and her open arms. She took her very first steps toward the person who made her believe she was still whole. Megan paused, letting the massive weight of the story settle heavily over the silent table. She looked at my father, and she looked at David. She said your daughter is a literal hero. She gave a 7-year-old girl her entire life back. She carried my entire family through our darkest, most terrifying nightmare. And you, she said, pointing a shaking finger at my father, you sit here and you complain that she did not order your chocolate cake. You dismiss her life-saving work because it does not come with a fancy corporate title. Megan shook her head, a look of profound disgust crossing her beautiful face. She said you are the ones who are completely blind. You have a magnificent, powerful woman sitting right in front of you, and you only see someone to pour your water. It is the most pathetic, heartbreaking thing I have ever witnessed. Nobody moved. The loud restaurant continued to buzz around us, but our long table was completely frozen in time. David was staring at the tablecloth, his face pale, unable to look at me or at Megan. My father looked like all the air had been suddenly punched right out of his lungs. The comfortable, dismissive narrative he had built his entire life around was entirely shattered, broken into a million tiny pieces by a stranger who saw my worth perfectly clear. The silence at the table was heavy and absolute. I watched my father. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked down at his empty hands resting on the white tablecloth. He had spent 30 years building a very specific version of our family, and Megan had just dismantled it in less than 3 minutes. David was staring at his plate, his face flushed a deep, uncomfortable red. He could not look at Megan, and he could not look at me. The golden boy had finally seen the heavy shadow he cast, and he did not like the shape of it at all. I did not feel a sudden victorious rush of cruel triumph. I only felt a deep, profound sadness. It is a terrible thing to realize your family only loves the convenient version of you. I placed my white linen napkin carefully on the wooden table. I reached down and I picked up my dark leather purse from the hard floor. The simple sound of the heavy leather moving seemed incredibly loud in the frozen silence of our table. My mother reached out her hand, trembling slightly, and she touched my arm. "Please stay, Jessica," she whispered, her voice thick with fresh tears. "We can just order the hot food and we can try to have a nice evening. We can fix this right now." I looked at her and my heart physically ached. She was so entirely conditioned to smooth things over, to sweep the broken glass under the rug and pretend no one was bleeding. I placed my hand gently over hers, feeling the coldness of her thin fingers. "I cannot stay, Mom," I said softly. "I cannot pretend this is just a minor argument over a chocolate cake." I looked at David. I said, "You are my brother, David. I have loved you and I have supported you my entire life. When you fell down, I was always the one who quietly picked you up. But you have never, not even once, asked me if I was tired of carrying you. You took my love and you turned it into an endless expectation. I cannot be your safety net anymore. You have to learn how to catch yourself." David swallowed hard, a tight lump forming in his throat. He nodded very slowly, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but he did not speak. Then I looked directly at my father. He finally raised his eyes, meeting my gaze across the wobbly table. The arrogant, dismissive authority was completely gone from his face. He looked older and suddenly very small. I did not feel angry anymore. The burning resentment had entirely burned out, leaving only cold, clean ash. "I said I spent 30 years trying to earn your basic respect, Dad. I thought if I set the table perfectly, or if I never complained, or if I made your life completely easy, you would finally see me. I thought you would finally be proud of me." I took a slow, deep breath, letting the heavy truth settle into the loud room. I said, "But you cannot see me because you only value people who make you look good to the outside world. My quiet work, my real work does not fit into your shiny narrative." He stared at me, his eyes wide and completely silent. I said, "I am incredibly proud of the woman I am, Dad. I am proud of the difficult work I do. I am proud of the small children I help every single day. I do not need your validation anymore. I am completely done shrinking myself just to make you feel comfortable. I am done setting the table for people who do not even care if I have a chair." I squeezed my mother and her cold hand one last time. I said, "Happy 60th birthday, Mom. I truly hope you enjoy your dinner." I let go of her hand. I pushed my chair back, the heavy wooden legs scraping loudly against the hard restaurant floor. I stood up tall, pulling my warm winter coat tightly around my shoulders. I looked at Megan sitting quietly next to David. I gave her a small, deeply grateful smile. She nodded back at me, a silent, powerful acknowledgement between two women who understood the exact same truth. I turned away from the long table. I did not look back. I walked through the incredibly loud, crowded dining room. The loud noise of clinking glasses and laughing strangers washed over me, but it did not bother me anymore. I walked past the busy host stand and I pushed the heavy wooden doors open, stepping out into the cold, dark night. The rain was still falling gently, washing the dirty city streets completely clean. I opened my simple umbrella, listening to the soft, rhythmic sound of the cold water hitting the tight fabric. I walked slowly toward my parked car. The cold air felt amazing on my flushed face. For the very first time in my entire adult life, my shoulders did not ache with heavy, invisible tension. I unlocked my car and I slid into the quiet, dry interior. I put my hands on the smooth steering wheel and I let out a long, shuddering breath. The old family system was completely shattered. The uncomfortable truth was laid completely bare, resting directly on the ruined dinner table. I started the engine, pulling out into the dark, wet street. I did not know what was going to happen tomorrow or the next day or next month, but I knew with absolute certainty that I was finally free. The days immediately following the massive birthday dinner passed in a thick, unprecedented silence. My phone did not ring a single time. The family group text message, usually a constant source of anxious demands, remained completely quiet. In the past, this kind of heavy silence would have absolutely terrified me. It would have felt like a strict punishment, a clear signal that I needed to rush back, apologize profusely, and fix whatever I had supposedly broken. But now the silence felt entirely different. It felt like a wide, open, breathable space. I woke up on Monday morning making my simple coffee in my quiet kitchen. I did not immediately grab my phone to see who needed me to solve their daily crisis. I stood by my small window watching the busy city wake up, and I realized my shoulders were finally resting in their natural, relaxed position. The heavy invisible apron was truly gone, and my chest felt incredibly light. I drove to the pediatric clinic feeling a deep, profound sense of restored purpose. When I walked through the double glass doors, the familiar smell of mild antiseptic and sweet baby lotion washed over me. This was my true sanctuary. This was the exact place where the toxic family system did not exist. I greeted the warm receptionist, grabbing my busy schedule for the long day. I walked down the brightly lit hallway, hearing the soft, encouraging voices of the other dedicated therapists and the occasional frustrated cry of a small child working hard. I put my heavy winter coat in my small locker, smoothing down my comfortable blue scrubs. I felt incredibly grounded, rooted entirely in the present, meaningful moment. My very first patient was a sweet little girl named Maya. She was 3 years old, born with a difficult condition that made her small leg muscles tight and highly uncooperative. Her tired mother brought her into the therapy room looking exhausted but deeply hopeful. I got down on the soft, brightly colored mat, sitting exactly at the eye level of Maya. I did not rush her into the hard exercises. We started with simple, gentle stretches. I sang a quiet, silly song, making her laugh out loud, turning the painful, frightening work into a gentle game. Maya had been trying to stand independently for weeks, holding tightly onto the low wooden rail, but she was entirely terrified to let go. Today, something felt very different in the quiet room. I knelt a few feet away from her, holding out my open hands. I smiled softly, keeping my voice very calm and perfectly steady. I said, "You can do this. Maya, I am right here to catch you." She looked at the sturdy wooden rail, and then she looked carefully at my open hands. Her small chest rose and fell with a deep, shaky breath. Slowly, she opened her tiny fingers. She let go of the safe, familiar wooden rail. She stood there wobbling slightly, completely unassisted for 5 long seconds. Her mother gasped loudly from the corner of the room, covering her mouth to muffle her sudden cry of absolute joy. Maya took one tiny, unsteady step forward, falling gently right into my waiting arms. I caught her, pulling her into a warm, tight hug. "You did it, Maya," I whispered against her soft hair. "You are so incredibly brave." I spent the rest of the week fully immersed in these profound, quiet miracles. I helped Leo learn how to throw a red plastic ball without losing his delicate balance. I helped a teenage boy named Sam regain his steady footing after a severe sports injury. Every single day, I poured my deep empathy and my hard-earned skill into people who truly needed it and who deeply valued it. I was not the invisible help here. I was the sturdy bridge they used to cross their most terrifying rivers. When I went home in the dark evenings, my apartment was deeply peaceful. I cooked simple, healthy dinners just for myself. I read my quiet books on my soft velvet sofa. I did not worry about my father and his fragile ego or my brother and his careless mistakes. The deep grief of the broken family system was still there, a dull ache in the background of my mind, but it was slowly losing its sharp, biting edge. I was finally learning how to mother myself, how to protect my own emotional energy, and how to hold my new boundaries with absolute grace. The painful friction of the past 30 years was slowly fading away, replaced by the quiet, steady rhythm of a life that finally belonged entirely to me. It had been exactly 12 days since I walked out of the crowded Italian restaurant. I was sitting in my quiet living room on a Thursday evening. I was wearing my soft gray sweatpants and a faded college t-shirt. I had just poured myself a warm cup of herbal tea. The soft yellow glow of my floor lamp cast long shadows across the wooden floor. It was a perfectly normal, entirely peaceful evening. And then there was a sudden sharp knock at my front door. I froze, holding my warm mug. I was not expecting any packages, and my friends always texted before coming over. I set my mug down gently on the coffee table. I walked slowly to the heavy wooden door, and I looked through the small glass peephole. I gasped softly. It was David. He was standing in my quiet hallway wearing his expensive wool coat, shifting his weight nervously from one foot to the other. He looked entirely out of place, like a lost tourist in a strange, unfamiliar country. My heart started to beat a little faster. David had only been to my apartment twice in the 5 years I had lived here. He only came when he needed a place to crash after a late city party, or when he needed me to hold on to a piece of mail for him. He never came just to see me. I rested my hand on the cool metal lock. I took a deep, steadying breath. I prepared myself for another angry demand or another selfish complaint. I turned the lock and I pulled the heavy door open. He looked up, meeting my eyes. He did not look angry. He looked incredibly tired and deeply uncertain. He cleared his throat softly. He said, "Hello, Jessica. I know I should have called first." I stood in the doorway blocking the entrance. I did not immediately smile, and I did not automatically invite him inside. The old Jessica would have thrown the door wide open, offering him a hot drink and a comfortable seat, eager to smooth away his obvious discomfort. The new Jessica simply waited, letting him do the actual work of explaining his sudden presence. I said, "Hello, David. What are you doing here?" He put his hands deep into his coat pockets. He said I was driving home from work and I realized I was only a few blocks away. He paused, looking down at the hallway floor. He said I wanted to talk to you if you have a few minutes. I looked at him carefully. He was missing his usual arrogant armor. The confident golden boy was completely gone, replaced by a confused, hesitant man who finally realized he had pushed his sister entirely too far. I stepped back, pulling the door open wider. I said you can come in for a little while. He walked slowly into my apartment. He took off his expensive coat, and he held it awkwardly in his arms, waiting for me to take it from him. I did not take it. I just pointed toward the small wooden coat rack by the door. He blinked, realizing his automatic assumption, and he hung it up himself. He walked into my small living room, looking around as if he had never truly seen it before. He looked at my bright green plants and my crowded bookshelves and the soft velvet sofa. He was finally looking at my actual life, a life I had built completely without his help or his approval. He sat down carefully on the edge of the velvet sofa. I sat down in the small armchair across from him. I did not offer him a drink. I did not try to fill the heavy, awkward silence. I just folded my hands in my lap and I waited for him to speak. He rubbed his hands together, staring at the small wooden coffee table. He said the house has been incredibly quiet this week. Mom and Dad have not really spoken much since the dinner. He looked up at me, his eyes full of complex, difficult emotions. He said Megan broke up with me, Jessica. She left on Tuesday morning. I felt a sudden pang of genuine surprise, but I kept my face perfectly neutral. I said, "I am sorry to hear that, David."
He let out a short, bitter laugh. He said she told me I was completely blind. She said she could not be with a man who treated his own sister like an unpaid servant. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He said I was so incredibly angry at her when she said it. I told her she did not understand our family dynamic. But after she left, I sat in my empty apartment and I kept hearing the terrible things I said to you at that restaurant. He swallowed hard, looking deeply ashamed. He said I blamed you for the cake. I blamed you for the table. I expected you to fix my own careless mistakes, and I got angry when you finally refused. He looked directly into my eyes and his voice cracked very slightly. He said you were right, Jessica. I treated you like a free service, and I never even noticed how heavy the burden was until you finally dropped it. I sat quietly in my small armchair, listening to the golden boy finally admit the painful truth. He was stepping completely out of his comfort zone, facing the ugly reality of his own selfish behavior. It was not a magical fix, and it did not erase 30 years of profound dismissal, but it was a genuine, desperately needed start. I looked at him sitting awkwardly on my soft velvet sofa, and I felt a very small, very fragile piece of my heavy heart begin to soften. I did not rush across the small room to comfort him. I did not offer him a warm tissue or tell him that everything was perfectly fine. For 30 long years, my immediate reaction to his obvious pain was to completely erase my own. Tonight, I simply stayed in my quiet chair and I let him fully experience the uncomfortable weight of his own profound apology. I said thank you for finally saying that, David. It means more to me than you could possibly know. He looked down at his empty hands, rubbing his palms together in a slow, nervous rhythm. He said, I do not expect you to instantly forgive me, Jessica. I just needed to come here and tell you that I was completely wrong. I was so wrapped up in my own stressful world that I never stopped to ask what my constant demands were actually costing you. I took a slow sip of my warm herbal tea, letting the soothing heat calm my racing nerves. I said it cost me my entire sense of self, David. I told him about the quiet evenings I spent cleaning the messy kitchen, listening to the loud laughter from the warm living room. I told him about the heavy graduation cake sitting abandoned in a white cardboard box, while everyone rushed to comfort him over a simple temporary breakup. I told him how I ate a single slice of vanilla cake over the cold kitchen sink, feeling completely invisible on a day I had worked so incredibly hard for. David looked up, his eyes wide with absolute shock and deep, genuine sorrow. He said, I never knew about the cake, Jessica. I was so incredibly self-absorbed. I am so deeply, truly sorry. I set my warm mug carefully on the wooden coffee table. I said you were deeply self-absorbed, David, but you were also just playing the exact role our father assigned to you. We both played our designated parts perfectly. You were the bright golden sun, and I was the quiet, invisible shadow that made you look even brighter. David leaned back against the soft cushions, letting out a long, heavy sigh. The city traffic hummed quietly outside my dark window, a steady rhythmic background to our raw, honest conversation. He said it was not always entirely easy being the golden sun, Jessica. Dad made me feel like his love was completely conditional. He made me feel like if I ever stumbled or if I ever failed to meet his massive expectations, I would instantly lose my place in the family. He looked at me, his eyes full of a vulnerable, quiet fear I had never seen before. He said I was completely terrified of falling, so I just let you constantly carry me. I listened to his quiet confession, and I finally understood the heavy burden he had been silently carrying. The family system was entirely toxic for both of us, just in completely different ways. His golden pedestal was just as much of a trap as my invisible kitchen corner. I said I understand that pressure, David. I really do, but I am not your safety net anymore. I cannot fix your careless mistakes, and I cannot manage your adult relationships. You have to learn how to stand entirely on your own. He nodded slowly, a look of quiet, mature acceptance settling over his handsome face. He said, I know that now, Jessica. I am trying to learn how to be a better man, and I want to learn how to be a real brother to you if you will actually let me try. I looked at him, seeing the genuine sincerity shining clearly in his tired eyes. The arrogant, dismissive sibling from the loud restaurant was completely gone. In his place, there was just a flawed, incredibly human man trying desperately to repair a deeply broken bond. I said, I want a real brother, David. I always have. But we have to build a completely new relationship from the very ground up. No more heavy aprons and no more silent sacrifices. He offered a small tentative smile, the first real smile I had seen all evening. He said no more aprons. I promise. He shifted slightly on the velvet sofa, looking around my quiet living room once more. He said Megan told me the entire story about Chloe and the pediatric clinic. She told me what you actually do every single day. He looked directly at me, his voice dropping into a low, incredibly respectful tone. He said, Is that really your daily life, Jessica? Do you really teach injured children how to walk again? I nodded slowly, feeling a warm, quiet pride blossom in my chest. I said, Yes, David. That is exactly what I do. I sit on the hard floor and I help them find their courage. He stared at me for a very long time, his eyes bright with unshed tears. He said, I am so incredibly proud of you, Jessica. You do the most beautiful, most important work in the entire world. I am so deeply sorry it took me 30 long years to finally see it. Hearing those specific words coming from the golden brother who had ignored me my entire life felt like cool water washing over a very old, very painful burn. It did not magically fix everything, but it was a profound, powerful beginning. We sat in my quiet apartment for another hour, talking softly about my dedicated work and his demanding job, learning how to simply be two equal adults, sharing a quiet, peaceful room. 2 days after David sat on my soft velvet sofa, a quiet Saturday morning arrived. I was sitting at my small wooden table drinking a hot cup of coffee. The apartment was completely still, bathed in bright morning sunlight. I was listening to the gentle hum of the city traffic outside my window, enjoying the profound peace of a weekend without any family demands. Then my phone buzzed gently against the smooth wood of the table. I picked it up expecting a casual message from Rachel, my kind coworker, asking about our plans for the afternoon. But the name flashing brightly on the digital screen made my stomach drop instantly. It was my father. I had not spoken to him or seen him since the disastrous birthday dinner at the loud Italian restaurant. I stared at the glowing phone, watching his name sit heavily in the palm of my hand. My mind immediately raced through the worst possible scenarios. I braced myself for another angry demand or a long, bitter lecture about family loyalty and broken traditions. I tapped the glass screen, slowly opening the new message. It was not a long, angry paragraph. It was very short and highly uncharacteristic. It did not start with a warm greeting or a casual hello. It simply said, "Your brother told me about your long conversation. He told me more about the pediatric clinic downtown." I took a slow, deep breath, reading the 2 short sentences over again. My heart was beating entirely too fast, thumping loudly against my ribs. I waited, staring at the bright screen. The next message popped up, a small gray bubble appearing out of nowhere. It said, "Megan was very harsh at the restaurant that night. But I looked up the clinic website online yesterday afternoon.
I read the detailed section about the severe trauma recovery program. I stopped breathing for a brief second. He had actually looked it up. The man who had dismissed my entire professional career as a simple, sweet volunteer project had actually taken the exact time to type the name of my clinic into a search bar. He had scrolled through the official pages. He had read the professional words describing the exact painful work I do every single day. I waited, watching the 3 small gray dots dance slowly on the screen, indicating he was still typing. It took him a very long time to send the very next message. I could clearly picture him sitting in his pristine home office, staring intensely at his expensive phone, struggling deeply with words he had never actually learned how to use. He was trying to navigate an emotional landscape he had completely avoided for his entire life. Finally, the final message appeared on my screen. It said, "It looks like very difficult work, Jessica. I imagine it takes a lot of deep patience and quiet strength." That was it. That was the entire complete message. There was absolutely no formal apology attached to the end of it. He did not say he was terribly sorry for ignoring me for 30 long years. He did not apologize for demanding I plan the massive birthday party or for treating me like the invisible hired help in front of a crowded restaurant. He was a proud, deeply stubborn man, and a complete vulnerable apology was simply beyond his current emotional capacity. But for a man who had never once asked me a single genuine question about my life, acknowledging the actual difficulty of my work was a massive, unprecedented step. He did not call it a silly hobby. He did not ask when I was finally getting a real corporate job with a corner office. He used the specific word work, and he openly admitted that it was difficult. He recognized my quiet strength. I sat quietly at my wooden table, holding the warm coffee mug tightly with both hands. I felt a complex, swirling mix of deep, conflicting emotions. A small, wounded part of me wanted to throw the heavy phone across the quiet room. I wanted to scream that his 3 short, awkward sentences were not nearly enough to erase a lifetime of complete, painful invisibility. I wanted a grand, sweeping apology, the kind they only show in dramatic, fictional movies. But I knew my father. I knew the rigid, suffocating, entirely practical world he grew up in, a world where open vulnerability was considered a terrible, shameful weakness. For him, sending those few awkward words was the absolute equivalent of moving a massive, heavy mountain. It was a tiny, incredibly fragile olive branch extended clumsily by a man who had never learned how to properly hold one. I placed the phone down gently on the wooden table. I did not reply immediately. I let the heavy words sit quietly in the peaceful air of my bright apartment. I realized in that quiet, solitary moment that I no longer needed his complete, perfect validation to feel entirely whole. His sudden acknowledgement was very nice, but it was not the required foundation of my personal self-worth anymore. My deep foundation was built on the soft blue mats of my clinic and the brave, faltering steps of the small children I helped save every single day. After 10 long minutes of quiet reflection, I picked the bright phone back up. I did not write a long, overly emotional response. I did not thank him profusely for his bare minimum effort, falling back into my old habit of smoothing things over. I simply matched his careful, measured, respectful tone. I typed, "It is very difficult work, Dad, but it is also incredibly rewarding. Thank you for taking the time to look it up." I pressed send, and I put the quiet phone into my warm pocket. I finished my hot coffee, looking out the bright window at the busy city moving below me. The old toxic family system was completely broken, but tiny, fragile green shoots were slowly starting to grow through the heavy, shattered concrete. It was not a perfect, beautiful garden yet, but it was finally real, and it was firmly rooted in the absolute truth. It had been exactly 3 weeks since the chaotic birthday dinner at the loud Italian restaurant. I was standing in my small, quiet kitchen washing a single ceramic bowl with warm, soapy water. The afternoon sun was streaming brightly through the small window, casting long, warm shadows across the wooden floor. My phone, resting quietly on the granite counter, suddenly began to vibrate. I dried my wet hands on a small towel, and I picked the phone up. It was my mother. I did not feel the usual familiar spike of heavy anxiety. I felt entirely calm and deeply grounded. I pressed the small green button, and I answered the call. "Hello, Mom," I said, keeping my voice very soft and perfectly even. "Hello, Jessica," she replied. Her voice was incredibly fragile and highly hesitant, like she was walking barefoot on very thin, dangerous ice. She took a slow, shaky breath. She said I was calling to see how your week was going. "My week has been very good, Mom," I said. "I spent the quiet week at the clinic, and I helped a few amazing kids take some very big steps." "That is wonderful to hear," she said, her voice sounding genuinely warm, but still incredibly cautious. We exchanged quiet, polite small talk for a few minutes. We talked about the mild spring weather and my quiet apartment, completely avoiding the massive, heavy elephant that was still standing right in the middle of our fractured relationship. Finally, my mother cleared her nervous throat. She said your father and I were wondering if you might want to come over for a simple Sunday dinner this weekend. The old familiar request hung heavily in the quiet air of my bright kitchen. A month ago, I would have immediately felt the crushing weight of the invisible apron. I would have instantly started making a mental list of all the difficult things I needed to buy and prepare and cook. I would have quietly braced myself for the deep exhaustion. I leaned against the cool granite counter. I looked out the bright window, watching a small bird land gently on a high branch. I said I would love to come to dinner, Mom. I could actually hear her let out a long, massive sigh of deep relief over the phone. She said, "Oh, Jessica, that makes me so incredibly happy. I will make sure we have all your favorite foods. But I need to tell you something first, Mom," I said, gently interrupting her sudden happy momentum. I kept my voice incredibly steady, completely devoid of any sharp anger, but absolutely firm. I said I am coming to the house, but things are going to be entirely different from now on. The line went completely quiet. She was listening intently, waiting for the difficult conditions she knew were coming. I said I will not arrive 2 hours early to help you prepare the hot food. I will arrive at 6 o'clock exactly when the dinner is scheduled to start. I will not walk into the kitchen and put on the heavy linen apron. I will not set the beautiful white plates, and I will not pour the red wine for Dad and David. I paused, making sure she was fully absorbing every single word. I said, I am not coming to the house to be the invisible staff anymore, Mom. I am coming strictly as a guest. I am coming simply as your daughter. If there is a sudden mess, David can help you clean it up. If a water glass is completely empty, Dad can walk to the kitchen and fill it himself. My mother did not argue. She did not call me incredibly difficult or terribly selfish the way she would have done just a few short weeks ago. She had finally seen the devastating consequence of pushing me entirely too far. She said, I understand, Jessica. Her voice was very quiet, but it was also deeply respectful. She said, you do not have to lift a single finger. We just want you to be there sitting at the table with us. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling a massive, invisible wall finally click solidly into its proper place. The firm boundary was officially set, clearly spoken, and quietly accepted. I said, thank you, Mom. I am looking forward to seeing you both. She hesitated for a brief second before she spoke again. She said, your father is trying Jessica. He really is. He is just a very stubborn, very old man, and he does not know how to change quickly. But he wants you to come home." I smiled a very small, quiet smile. I knew my father was not going to magically transform into a warm, deeply emotionally available parent overnight. He was going to stumble, and he was going to make thoughtless comments, and he was going to forget the new rules. But I was no longer afraid of his stumbling because my own footing was finally secure. I said, "I know he is trying, Mom. I will see you on Sunday at 6 o'clock. I ended the quiet call, placing the phone back down on the cool counter. I looked around my peaceful, beautiful apartment. I had entirely survived the terrible storm. I had stood my firm ground facing the intense pressure of a 30-year-old family system, and I had absolutely refused to break. I was going back to my childhood home, but I was returning as a completely different woman. I was returning as a woman who finally knew the profound, priceless value of her own quiet presence. A few days before the scheduled Sunday dinner, I received a quiet text message from Megan. She invited me to her parents' house, saying she had something incredibly special she wanted me to see. I drove over on a bright Saturday morning, parking my car on the quiet suburban street. The air was crisp and the sun was shining warmly on the paved driveway. I walked slowly up the concrete path. The front door was already wide open, letting the gentle spring breeze drift through the quiet house. I stood on the small porch, preparing to knock gently on the wooden frame. But before I could even raise my single hand, a small figure appeared in the bright hallway. It was Chloe. She was standing completely on her own right in the middle of the long hallway. There were no sturdy parallel bars, and there was no metal walker, and there was no anxious adult hovering right behind her to catch her if she fell. She was just a 7-year-old girl standing firmly on 2 legs that doctors had once said might never carry her again. She was wearing a bright yellow dress, and her dark hair was pulled back into a messy ponytail. She looked up, and her bright blue eyes met mine through the open doorway. Her face completely opened up, radiating the pure, unfiltered joy that children only show to the people they truly trust. She did not hesitate for a single second. She started to walk toward me. Her steps were entirely deliberate and slightly unsteady, but they were absolutely hers. She moved one small foot and then the other, recreating the exact painful rhythm we had practiced hundreds of times on the soft blue clinic mats. I watched her move down the long hallway, completely captivated by the profound miracle of her simple motion. She walked all the way to the front door, stepping carefully over the small wooden threshold. She walked right out onto the bright porch, and she reached her small arms out toward me. I dropped immediately to my knees on the hard concrete. I opened my arms wide, and she practically fell into my chest, wrapping her small arms tightly around my neck. I held her, feeling the strong, steady beat of her small heart against my own. She smelled like sweet strawberry shampoo and the fresh outdoor air. I buried my face in her soft hair, holding on to her as tightly as I possibly could. All the heavy emotional weight I had carried for 30 long years, every single ignored accomplishment, every heavy dinner plate, every dismissive comment from my father suddenly went entirely quiet. The deep pain was not completely erased, but it was absolutely silenced by the pure, undeniable reality of this single moment. Because this little girl truly saw me. She walked toward me on the very legs we had slowly rebuilt together, and she whispered my name into my ear like it was the safest, most comforting word she knew. I looked up, blinking back thick, hot tears. Megan was standing quietly inside the open doorway. She was crying softly, holding her hand over her mouth, watching her little sister embrace the woman who had saved her. Megan stepped out onto the bright porch, kneeling down right beside us on the hard concrete. She wrapped her warm arms around both of us, holding us in a tight, incredibly emotional hug. We sat there on the front porch, two grown women and one brave little girl bound entirely by the quiet, powerful strength of healing. We cried happy tears in the warm spring sunlight. I realized, sitting there on the hard ground, that my father could call my work a little volunteer project for the rest of his long life, and it would never hurt me again. His narrow, limited view of the world could not possibly diminish the massive, beautiful truth of what I had actually accomplished. I was a dedicated healer. I was a safe harbor. I was the person people looked for when their entire world was falling completely apart. That was my true identity, and it was worth infinitely more than a perfectly set dining table or a heavy linen apron. The following Sunday evening, I drove to my parents' house. I pulled into the wide driveway at exactly 6:00. I did not carry a homemade dessert, and I did not bring a heavy centerpiece. I walked up to the large front door and I knocked gently. My mother opened the door wearing a bright, nervous smile. She hugged me warmly, ushering me into the familiar entryway. The house smelled like roasted chicken and warm bread, but the atmosphere felt entirely different. It felt slightly chaotic and wonderfully human. I walked into the warm living room. My father was sitting in his usual leather chair. He stood up when I entered the quiet room. He looked slightly awkward, unsure of how to navigate this entirely new dynamic. He said hello. "Jessica, it is very good to see you." I smiled softly, keeping my posture entirely relaxed. "I said it is good to see you too, Dad." David walked out of the busy kitchen. He was holding a large bowl of green salad, looking slightly stressed. He was wearing an old casual shirt, and his sleeves were rolled up. He set the heavy bowl down on the dining table. He looked at me and he offered a genuine tired smile. He said, "I made the salad completely by myself, so please pretend it tastes amazing." I laughed a real unforced laugh. I said, "I promise I will eat every single bite, David." When dinner was finally ready, we all sat down around the large wooden table. There were no beautifully written place cards. The expensive white plates with the gold trim stayed hidden in the high cabinet. We used the heavy blue stoneware, the casual, everyday plates that I had always loved. My mother had forgotten to put out the salt, and the crystal water pitcher was completely missing. The old Jessica would have immediately jumped up, rushing to the kitchen to fix the minor imperfections. The new Jessica simply sat in her chair, resting her hands peacefully in her lap. My father noticed the missing water pitcher. He looked down the long table, a brief flash of his old annoyance crossing his aging face. He started to look toward me out of sheer lifelong habit, but then he stopped. He caught himself right in the middle of his automatic reaction. He closed his mouth, taking a slow, quiet breath. He pushed his heavy chair back, standing up slowly. He said, "I will go get the water pitcher from the kitchen." He walked away, leaving the three of us sitting in a shocked, profound silence. My mother looked at David, her eyes wide with complete disbelief. David looked at me, giving me a small, knowing nod. My father returned a moment later, placing the heavy crystal pitcher exactly in the center of the wooden table. He sat back down, picking up his silver fork, acting as if he had always poured his own water. The long meal was not entirely perfect. The conversation was slightly stilted, filled with careful pauses and hesitant questions. But it was completely real. At the very end of the dinner, when the blue plates were completely empty, I stayed entirely seated. I did not reach for a single dirty dish. David stood up, stacking the heavy plates together. He carried them carefully into the quiet kitchen, leaving me sitting comfortably at the table with my parents. I drank my cool water, feeling a deep, abiding sense of lasting peace. The heavy burden was finally shared, and I was finally allowed to just simply be. True family love requires seeing each other clearly. When you stop carrying the silent burdens, you give others the chance to step up. Setting boundaries is an act of deep self-respect. You are not meant to be invisible. Your worth is found in the light.